What if the greatest threat to power wasn't a sword, a kingdom, or an army, but a book? Not a book of war, but a book of truth. Imagine a place where every whisper of ancient medicine, science, astronomy, mathematics, even lost civilizations was collected, cataloged, and shared freely. A place that was centuries ahead of its time and centuries ahead of its enemies. A place so enlightened, it became dangerous not to the people, but to those who controlled them. This isn't mythology. This place existed. And then, suddenly it didn't. Buried not by time, but by intention. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria. It's the most powerful place in human history that no one wanted you to remember. And to understand why it was erased, we must first ask, what was it really? And more importantly, who was afraid of it? You're watching StillRise, where silence speaks louder than noise, and history teaches us how to live today. Chapter 1. The Dream of Ptolemy in the 3rd century BCE. After the death of Alexander the Great, Egypt was left in the hands of one of his trusted generals, Ptolemy I Soter. But Ptolemy did not dream of conquering land. He dreamt of conquering ignorance. And to do that, he would build a sanctuary, not for gods, but for knowledge. A place where every written idea, every recorded word, could be collected in one immortal archive. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, became home to what would be called the Great Library. But this was not just a building, it was a revolution. Ships arriving in Alexandria were searched for scrolls, their knowledge copied and stored. Travelers, scientists, philosophers, all were welcomed not for who they were, but for what they knew. There was no single religion inside the library, no state-approved truth, only a hunger for everything. From the secrets of the stars to the power of plants, to the theories of how the universe might have begun. It was as if the human race for the first time stopped whispering and began listening. But light like this casts long shadows. And the more it illuminated the minds of the people, the more it blinded those in power. Chapter 2. Why the library was feared greater than why would anyone fear a library? Because knowledge is dangerous, not to the seeker, but to the controller. The library questioned the divine right of kings. It taught people how the stars moved, not because of gods, but gravity. It revealed how medicine worked, not by prayer, but by anatomy and herbs. Every truth discovered dismantled an illusion, and illusions were what rulers depended on. The library did not belong to a single empire. It was a republic of the mind, and that was revolutionary. Some say over 400,000 scrolls were stored inside its walls, not just Greek knowledge, but Persian, Indian, Egyptian, Babylonian. It was global, and it was growing. In the minds of some, that was a threat too big to ignore. And right now, in our own digital world, information flows faster than ever. But what we forget is, the most dangerous moments in history weren't when people lacked knowledge. It was when they had it, and someone wanted it gone. The Library of Alexandria didn't just hold books. It held the blueprint for a freer world, and someone wanted that blueprint destroyed. Part 2. The fire they couldn't control. They say the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of a world that was starting to ask too many questions. Not just what is the world made of, but why are we ruled the way we are? Who controls truth, and who benefits from our ignorance? For centuries, empires had ruled with swords, but in Alexandria, the battle shifted. People began ruling with ideas, and that terrified those in power. The library was more than scrolls, held the minds of entire civilizations. From Egypt to India, from Greece to Persia, each scroll a stolen breath of a forgotten thinker, ideas that could tear kingdoms apart. Knowledge was crossing borders. Languages were being translated. Old beliefs were being challenged. It wasn't just a library. It was rebellion inked in parchment, and rebellions are dangerous. So how do you destroy a revolution you can't see? You don't need armies. You need flames. The fires that consumed the library weren't accidents. They were orders. From those who understood, if people begin to think for themselves, you can't rule them the same way ever again.
Ow.
And so the world's greatest treasure was turned to ash. But here's the part they never tell. Part 3. The war against memory knowledge can be rewritten. History can be edited, but memory is dangerous. It lingers, it survives, it resists fire. After the Library of Alexandria burned, something strange happened. People didn't just mourn the loss of scrolls, they began to remember them louder. Scribes recreated what they had read. Philosophers quoted what they once studied. Travelers passed whispers across oceans, and storytellers. They wrapped facts in myths so they could survive kings and crusades. Memory became a weapon, because if you can't kill knowledge, you try to replace it. And that's what came next. A new order began rewriting the past. They told the world, greater than the ancients, knew less than you think. The earth was never round. Democracy was never real. The gods chose your ruler. And slowly, a generation grew up blind to what had been lost. But here's the secret no empire ever solved. The truth has gravity. Even buried, it pulls. Even silenced, it echoes. And every now and then, a curious soul stumbles across it. Not by accident, but by instinct. Historical layer in the centuries after the library's fall, echoes of its wisdom began surfacing. Again. Arabic scholars in Baghdad preserving and expanding Greek texts. Indian mathematicians developing algebra before Europe even knew its name. African astronomers charting stars with precision the West wouldn't match for centuries. What does that tell you? The fire burned the building. It couldn't burn the awakening. And that's what frightened rulers the most.
I thought people were learning again.
But they were learning without permission. That's the war that never ended, a war against unapproved memory. Because if you remember what you were, you begin to question what you've become. Maybe that's why our schools skip over Alexandria. Maybe that's why you never heard about Hypatia, or why the scrolls of Carthage disappeared, why the voices of ancient mothers were erased. Because knowledge isn't just about what's known, it's about who's allowed to know it. And once you realize that the world never looks the same again. Part 4. The secret power of hidden books. What if the greatest minds in history didn't die, they were silenced? They didn't disappear, they were erased. Their voices buried under dust, their discoveries labeled heresy, their books burned. Not because they were wrong, but because they were right. At the wrong time, because knowledge isn't always convenient to those in power. Every time a new truth rises, an empire trembles. When the telescope revealed Earth wasn't the center of the universe, it wasn't just science that was challenged. It was control. It was centuries of belief. It was authority built on lies. And when that authority shakes, it doesn't debate, it destroys. Think about this. In ancient China, during the Qin dynasty, the emperor ordered thousands of books to be burned. Why? Because they challenged his version of history. They taught people to question, to think, to dream beyond his walls. So he burned the words. Then he buried the scholars. Alive greater than in Nazi Germany. Students in 1933 gathered in the middle of Berlin not to protest, but to burn books. Books written by Jewish authors, scientists, philosophers, poets, not because they were dangerous, but because they were powerful, because they reminded people of freedom of truth. Truth, once read, is hard to forget, and that's what they feared the most. Maybe that's why tyrants fear writers more than warriors, because writers don't just fight for now, they fight for forever, with ink, with words, with truth. You can kill a man, but you can't kill a story. You can burn a book, but not the idea that wrote it. Part 5. The dangerous power of remembering. What happens when silence becomes memory? Not just a pause. It's not just forgetting, but a forced silence. A silence planted in generations. Raised like tradition, taught like law, and eventually, you forget that there was ever a voice before. Think about colonized nations. Languages banned, names changed, maps redrawn. History didn't just happen. It was edited. Schools stopped teaching the truth and began teaching what was safe. But memory is rebellion. To remember is to resist. To ask who were we before they told us who we are? It's where the danger begins when a man no longer forgets. A woman remembers her roots, her stories, her language greater than she, no longer waits to be saved. She becomes the storm. Why do you think forgotten heroes are never taught in classrooms? Why do you think the quiet warriors, the peaceful rebels, the thinkers, are always missing from your textbooks? Because silence was never an accident. It was policy and remembering. That's revolution. They tried to bury us. But they forgot greater than they thought silence would erase us. But we are made of echoes. We are descendants of whispers that refuse to die. Each time you remember, you prove them wrong. Every time you learn a name, they tried to erase every time you read a banned book. Every time you ask why when others say just accept, you become part of the rebellion. Not with weapons, but with wisdom. They tried to bury us, but they forgot. We were seeds. Part 6. The quiet ones who changed everything. The world never saw them coming greater than they weren't the loud ones. Not the ones in headlines, not the ones with armies or speeches. They were gardeners, writers, mothers, teachers, ordinary people with extraordinary conviction. They planted seeds of change in the most silent ways, by raising a child to think, by refusing to lie, by choosing peace even when peace was dangerous. Their names aren't etched in stone, but their impact is written in time. You've never heard of them, but you feel their legacy. That village that protected a child during a war, that teacher who taught the truth in secret, that stranger who hid a family during genocide, they didn't yell, they didn't post it, they just did it because it was right. History bends quietly. People think revolutions come with noise, but most of them start with silence, with a refusal to participate, with a single person saying, "Not this time," no announcement, just a change in direction. Think of the unknown monk who set himself on fire in protest, not with anger, but with peace in his heart. Think of the barefoot child who walked miles to school every day so the next generation could dream. No spotlights, just sacrifice. Real change wears no crown. It walks alone in the early morning or the darkest hour. That's why most people miss it. It doesn't come with applause. The loudest silence in history, greater than you know who really changed the world? The people who were never allowed to speak, but kept whispering anyway. Till generations later, their whispers became movements. They weren't trying to be remembered. They were trying to do what was right, and somehow that's what made them immortal. Maybe you don't have to be known to be legendary. Maybe the loudest thing you'll ever do, stay silent. When the world begs you to scream and just keep walking toward the light, alone. Greater than because sometimes the ones who whisper change more than the ones who shout. Leading to part 7. Greater than so next time someone says, "Who are you to make a difference?" Nothing. Greater than because the ones who changed everything said nothing to. Part 7. The unrecorded revolution. Greater than there are no parades for those who start revolutions in silence. No headlines, no applause, no crowds. Just a quiet decision made in a quiet room that enough is enough. A woman who studies law at night while raising children by day. A boy who returns every book to the shelf after the librarian tells him it's not for you. A man who rewrites history one page at a time, alone in the basement of a forgotten library. These people, they're not on the covers of magazines. They're not trending. They're not recognized. But they are remembered by time, by truth. The echo they leave behind. The world never saw them coming because they made no noise. But they shook the foundation beneath it because they read when they were told not to. They learned when they were told to obey. They believed when the world told them to forget. They were not the rulers, not the famous, not the rich, just ordinary people greater than with extraordinary silence. Part 8. The last voice they couldn't silence greater than you were never meant to be loud. Not because you're weak. Because the truth doesn't need volume, it needs depth. I told you to speak up, but only if it sounded like them. Only if it fit their narrative. Only if it didn't threaten what they built. But silence. The kind that becomes unavoidable. And one day a generation opens its eyes. Not with a scream, but with a calm, knowing look. A calm return to truth. A quiet refusal to stay blind. And that's when history shifts. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper. The kind of whisper that becomes legend. Kind of whisper that starts with Part 9, the whisper that remains greater than maybe no one will remember your name. Maybe no statue will be built, no headlines, no applause. But that's never why you started. You didn't come here to be seen. You came here to see, clearly, to walk a silent path and leave it better than you found it. Quietly, steadily, unshakably, greater than, and if your story touched even one soul, if your silence helps someone else hear themselves again, then you've already changed more than you know. What we learn greater than we often think that change comes from noise, from shouting, from force. No. But history whispers something different. It tells us that the ones who moved mountains didn't always roar, they endured. In silence, in discipline, in faith. We learned that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. That being unknown doesn't mean being unimportant. And that walking your path in silence is sometimes the greatest revolution. In a world full of noise, your calm is your strength, your stillness is your resistance, and your silence. That may be the loudest thing you ever leave behind. If this whisper spoke to you, let it live on. Subscribe, and keep walking with us in silence.